hope you're all well. I hope you've all been safe during all this madness. We're so glad to be gathered here together with you. My name is Alex McDonald. I am the film programmer here at the Philosophical Research Society. Who is here at PRS for the first time tonight? Okay, a lot of people. Let me tell you a bit about where you are. The Philosophical Research Society is in its 91st year in 2025. It was founded in 1934 by a man named Manly Palmer Hall, who was a comparative religion scholar, author, lecturer, world traveler, philosopher, and a mystic in his own right. He's best known for his life's work kind of tying together disparate spiritualities, esoteric and occult ideologies and philosophies, and allowing folks to forge their own spiritual path. He invited seekers of all sorts. That's what the PRS was founded for, is a space for folks to come, a place with curiosity and inquiry, and we continue that legacy forward as a 501c3 arts and events nonprofit, recognizing that the arts are a spiritual path in their own right, providing a disparate and wide array of arts programming, allowing people to find what resonates, what inspires them. Tonight we are screening, it's so nice to see such a nice crowd for a film that I think probably most of you, had you heard of this film before? Because I hadn't really. She has. I hadn't really heard of it, and it's the first science fiction feature film, pretty much, ever made. You know, the Méliès made their films, but this is a feature-length film, Danish film, utterly incredible, and I want to thank our friend Jay for bringing it to our attention. Who I'm going to introduce now and welcome. Jay has restored this film himself. He has scored this film himself. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about that process both before and after the screening. He'll be here to answer some questions as well. So, Jay Woelfel has spent his career working in all phases of production and post-production. He has directed 14 feature films, won the first Interactive Academy Award for his Titanic documentary narrated by Patrick Stewart, edited by Bronx Cheers, which was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Short, won an Emmy for his film of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark, and was included by The Ohio State University in its permanent exhibit, Buckeye Brilliance, among other distinguished graduates in the Students' Union. Jay has scored 59 films and won awards for 19 of these for Best Music Score. Music came first as Jay played the baritone horn in concert bands from the 4th grade on. Film music attracted him to films for their orchestral but often experimental and modern scores. He took console organ lessons for 3 years in high school and began scoring his own and other people's films in film school. Heavenship is the second silent film he has scored, having previously scored and won Best Score for the 1928 silent version of The Fall of the House of Usher. In addition, he did scores for Island of Lost Souls and The Old Dark House, neither of which had an original score previously. He won the Best Feature Score at the Austin Science Fiction Film Festival for both. Would you please welcome Jay Woelfel?
Thank you. The one person who knows this film is actually Danish, so she had a head start. Okay. So don't feel bad, don't feel bad. Unless you're Danish and didn't know, then you should feel really bad. I won't talk a lot up front. I'm glad he mentioned the Philosophical Research Society because there is some philosophy in this movie, so I'll point out a few things to kind of watch because it's very interesting. This is before science fiction films were called science fiction films. And this is really a science fiction movie because it really deals with the same questions in which you see in a lot of sort of space travel movies since then, like how do you talk to an alien race? And this film's sort of the father or maybe the grandfather to Day the Earth Stood Still. This film was produced by this guy, Ole Olesson, who I've misspelled his name in these credits, and it's misspelled on the IMDb as well. He formed Nordisk Film, which is still in business to this day, and they're currently nominated for an Oscar for Best Foreign Film for The Girl with the Needle. So this is the founder. He wanted to make films in Denmark for the whole world. He didn't just want to make regional movies. The Danish, with him sort of in charge, made the world's first Into the World movie called End of the World, which predates this film. And then he did this film, which was made in the midst of the First World War. Denmark was a neutral country. But this was shot in 1917, released in 1918. It didn't make its way to America until 1920. The Danish Film Institute has been doing a huge, massive silent film project, which they actually finished at the end of last year. And as we're sitting here, they're sitting there. They had a whole festival to celebrate the end of this, showing a lot of silent films. So you'll see how this is sort of reaction to the First World War without. They made other World War I films in Denmark also, but Denmark was the neutral. So in their World War I films, they never really say that it's Germany or England or France. They're sort of, later there was a film made in America called Deluge, which is an early sound film, which is the second End of the World movie ever made. I bring that up because after End of the World. In Deluge, there's a pre-credit thing, a roll-up, basically saying, hey, okay, yeah, we know the Lord promised he would not destroy the earth with water again, so like, just go with this, okay? We're not saying that didn't happen. So there's this like apology at the beginning of the movie. This movie's whole attitude about religion is, I think, sort of, it's really interesting the way there is Christianity, but ultimately it's not really about that. And I find that really kind of unique. And again, given in America years later, they felt the need to sort of explain, okay, you guys are Christians, but don't hate us, Another thing is interesting to me is this is really the first, this movie when it was released came after Intolerance. So a lot of critics, Intolerance was not a hit movie. This was not either. It was the last film Ole produced, actually. Critics called this a space opera, and that's where we get the term. And you'll see some very low angles with some posing, you'll see where that comes from. So you're seeing the first space opera. So what's interesting to me is the attitude about science and religion in this movie is sort of the opposite of what I might expect from somebody at that time. It's a contemporary movie. It's not set in the distant era of 1960 or anything like that. Watch the character names in particular. This film has a certain sense of humor to it. The name of the ship is Excelsior, which was one of the original titles on the screenplay, which means ever upward. The lead character, are sort of Captain Kirk-esque, and very much with a sort of like Kirk agenda, is Avanti, which of course is Italian for go forward or advance. The sort of villain of the piece is Dr. Dubious, which, yes, in Danish, it's pretty much the same word. I showed this to somebody, and they're like, wait a minute, whoa, dubious? I was like, yep. Avanti's best friend is called Dr. Kraft. Dr. Kraft builds the spacecraft in the movie. He's the artisan which I just sort of noticed when I was like, I meant to write these things down. I was like, oh, what's craft? Does that mean what I think it does? Yes. There's an American in this movie named David Dane, who is the fat drunkard. There's a sort of sinister Russian. It is, don't hate Avanti because he has a few similarities with Elon Musk, because it's a whole kind of different thing. So please don't hate on him for that. These are all people who've done movies before. The lead guy is actually Norwegian. They're Norwegian, Mac. They're Norwegians. He played a lot of sort of Valentino-esque sheiks and stuff, and eventually got really tired of it and sort of retired because he was done playing the same sheik over and over again. So I'm sure he was very happy to not play a sheik in this movie. The director's full name is actually Forrest Holger Madsen, but he goes by Holger Madsen in a sort of Cher-like maneuver, I guess, or he just didn't like the name. It's written by two people, Sophus Michaelis, who's credited as having written the novel, but you'll see the way they credit the movie as being a novel in 6 chapters. Again, there was no science fiction. at the time. So he did write some other films for Holder Madsen also. And like I said, and Ole Olesen was the co-writer on it. This is the first and last Danish science fiction film for many years until the immortal classic Reptilicus. And I can't top name dropping Reptilicus, so I will be selling a few CDs of the movie afterwards. You remember what these are. So we'll be in the lobby with those. That stands for compact disc. I know it's a strange word. So I'll do a Q&A and talk some more and show some real interesting production stills. The Danish Film Society did a great job of like assembling old programs for all their films. It's really a well-done website. There's only 2 films on there currently that actually have English intertitles. This is not an archival restoration. And when I started working on the movie, I was like, there's stuff missing. This is a 1920 print from America because the opening title is in English. And so I started just seeing things I thought were like holes. And then I found some production stills of effect shots which were no longer in the movie. So I had some guys, one of whom's here tonight, who all credit afterwards, who like sort of helped me do this. And there was a montage sequence that, again, seemed all kind of chopped up and too short. And so you haven't seen or heard of this movie before, but this is not the one you'll find on YouTube. So that's the sort of, Giorgio Moroder kind of did that with Metropolis, where he did his own edit of the film. And I did certain things with color and certain things which I always thought should be kind of done with silent films in general. The score I did myself. It's all samples. Sometimes when you do particular movies, you pick some sort of angle, and my angle on this was that there'd be no woodwinds. Not that I always hate them, but screw those guys. You guys go home. So it's mostly it's everything else, just no woodwinds. Damn it. So please enjoy the movie. I'll hopefully answer your questions later, and please stick around. And thanks for coming out to see Heavenship, or Himmelskibet is the original title.
How did you first discover this film?
Okay, so COVID happened. Remember that? So I was like going to my bookshelf, like, what are these books I've owned forever and I've never read? And I had this book which I bought at a used bookstore with a friend of mine. We co-bought this book, and I ended up, they're called like The History of Science Fiction Films. And on page 1, they talk about this film and a German serial called Homunculus, which is being restored, but it's still kind of lost. And I remembered I had a book my father bought me when I was like 10 years old about science fiction movies. I was like, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. I looked up, and there's like 1 photo in that book. So there's like a chapter and 1 photo. So I went and did Google, hey, whatever, and discovered that the Danish Film Institute had just started this huge process of transferring, as they put it, every scrap of silent film ever shot in Denmark. And they just finished this weekend, and they're having a big film festival showing the stuff. So there was quite a good version, and there was immediate people that go, hey, I'm Jay Woelfel, blah, 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 I'd like to do this thing. And I talked to the head of it, this guy named Lars, and I said, there's not a lot of market for this, but I could maybe pay something or whatever. And he goes, you know what? He goes, everything today just comes down to money. He goes, this was a huge grant project we're doing, and otherwise this stuff would just rot. And he goes, as long as we can put it on our website, just do it. So that was great. So that's how I'd never heard of the movie myself either, except that picture in that book, which I was sort of like, what is this movie? So then I had already scored stuff, and again, it's COVID, so what's happening, originally the first film I scored, which never had a music score, was Eye on the Lost Souls, which is a movie I loved, and finally a decent version came out. So I did that just as kind of a personal challenge. If it sucked, I would never show it to anybody. And then this film festival in Austin, I'd met him at a New York festival. I said, hey, told him, and they looked and said, let's show it. And I won best score at the festival for it. Part of what's great about doing this is people like you is seeing these movies, which many people have never seen or even heard of on the big screen. Somebody, after showing Island of Lost Souls, this Canadian special effects guy, just fell in love with 4x3. He'd never seen a movie in 4x3 before. So then I did Fall of the House of Usher, this fascinating film. It was actually Louis Buñuel got his first film job working on this movie. I scored, that was a silent, and I won another film festival with that for best music. So I was like, wow, hey, maybe this is working for somebody. So watching this movie, part of my interest in it was I've scored a lot of horror movies. I love horror and genre stuff. Why is only horror and science fiction called genre movies? A comedy, isn't that a genre movie? Isn't a drama a genre movie? I just hate that paintbrush, you know. So I watched this, I was like, okay, this is a largely sort of positive movie. What the hell will I do? As that almost alone was enough to do it. How am I gonna, like, you know, and I think I did. So that was the other sort of, the other just interest in doing it was I hadn't scored this movie before, you know what I mean? So that was my point of entry for Heavenship. Let me talk about just a few of these stills, and then you guys can just ask questions, and this will run as sort of a party tape behind us. That's the director, Forrest Holger, with the crew. In America, when this movie was released, they said cast of thousands. They have a lot of people in this movie. You can go to the next slide. This is Nordisk Film Corporation. I think the guy in the middle is Ole Olsen. No, he's here. This is Ole. The founder of Nordisk Film, the guy looking at a piece of film. Go ahead to the next one. I love this, a production still. This is classic. Today you'll still see this. See the guy goofing around back there in the... This is interesting because you can see the rig for to land the ship, which they show very little of in the movie. I don't know if some of it's been lost or if it functioned really badly, but that's what interests me about this. This is Ole on set, again on the left, with our female messiah coming to save Earth. How about that, America? The deluge, God said he wouldn't destroy the Earth. Yeah, I think this is far more taking a big step. Okay. This is the same thing, wider, from somebody's probably scrapbook. This is Holger and some of his other movies. This is the first page of the script, which they just put this up. When I was doing the movie, I had somebody who promised me they'd go to the one library in Copenhagen, find the script, and I wrote a list of questions about stuff that seemed missing from the film because I wanted to restore more stuff, and he, of course, then didn't go. But now I could get this, I could translate this into English. But yeah, the original title is, this is their main website, Danish Film Institute. This is the page for Trip to Mars, where they say he's inspired by Napoleon. I haven't had the heart to tell them that's actually Columbus, not Napoleon. He's inspired. I love this. This is, you know, the kind of their version of the Leo the Lion. This is the actual lion. They stood on polar bear. They stood on this globe. Go to the next one. And then he became this drawn version. Or this drawn version, or today, this is their logo. So I just love that they still have the polar bear on the top of the Earth. That's the last one, right? This is again, it came out in America in 1920. So this is some of a revelation, a novelty feature, again, before they knew what to call, what is science fiction. So these will just kind of run in the background. Yeah, I love the fact that the Martians all dress up kind of like babies. They've got those things on their head. And the whole, there's a Greek or Roman myth which has a similar thing where people go to an island and they like don't eat meat. And they're like, well, how do you do this? And they like kill something and the inhabitants are, you know, react that way. Oh, let me thank three guys, one of whom is here, Dennis Peterson. Dennis, Tony, and Vijay, who's actually in India, who did some specific cleanup and sort of created or like fixed some mats. Sometimes the matting process of the ship, it was kind of translucent, so we just sort of like, you know, come on, this is just a, you know. So Dennis Peterson's actually right back there. Questions?
Yeah, the montage with Earth Bad, was that the montage you referenced earlier with like you felt it was, and then did they actually shoot whole battlefield scenes?
All that stuff, those are some, there's a movie called, I think, Peace on Earth, and something like Behind the Lines or something, which are actually other Holger Madsen films, which are about World War I, although they're not about Germany or France, they're sort of generic. So I just went through their website going, if I'm going to do this, I should look and see if they have anything else from Holger or whatever. And so then I got that, so I assembled a whole bunch of movies and watched stuff and started putting it together. And I was like, okay, so I'm editing this, but I can't cut it like I'd cut it today. So how do I cut a montage without it being so obviously cut too fast or whatever? So occasionally there's maybe an awkward pause. I thought it was really interesting that they actually had footage of, there's one film which is largely like a whole urban kind of dissolution of society, a whole urban warfare. And so I was really interested to like see and show that rather than just all the army stuff. But the guy riding on the horseback with the death riding on a horse, that's another Holger Madsen film. Yeah, some of it is not his, but that was, and some's the same DP. I think this movie's beautifully shot. This Lewis guy. I think I should have mentioned her. He was at Denmark, and I think that DP was the first one to build a dedicated camera mount for motion picture cameras. So remember, this is 1917, so people wouldn't have really seen aerials before. But Denmark was the first one to do that.
That aerial footage of the city was shot for the film?
Yeah, that was shot for the film. Yeah, that's all, I assume, Copenhagen and the harbors. Yes.
Can you describe your process for scoring a scene? How exactly do you go about doing it? Sure.
Yeah, I'll get back to you too. I saw your hand, I'll come back to you. Silent movies, of course, although I do put pauses in. Oh, I hadn't watched this movie since David Lynch died, and some of these pausing moments and stuff, I was kind of like, but I also, when I needed winds, because I wanted to use some sound effects, I didn't use wind instruments, because, screw those guys. But I needed winds, so I was looking around, and Alan Splett, who was a David Lynch, I think they were with the American Film Institute together, and he did sound effects for Eraserhead and a lot of films. They were selling his wind library. I was like, okay, if I'm going to have winds, I'm going to get Alan Splett winds. So those are Alan Splett's, because it was so windy in a lot of that footage. I was like, we should feel this. I really sat down at the beginning to just try to come up with some sort of positive theme for what the thing was. Most of the score is all ascending stuff. At home, when they're sort of in Earth, it kind of goes up and down. It's like waves. It's almost kind of a Mahler kind of thing. You hear at the beginning and the end is this sort of the lapping waves. So I just sat down and like goofed around for a long time, and then took some of that and started to try to put it to picture and go, okay, yeah, this works or that doesn't. And then knew I needed Martian music. So the Mars stuff is all written, and I kind of like, it started as a very kind of simple, almost kind of like nursery rhyme thing, but then I added kind of parallel notes and sort of dissonances, which just kind of happen occasionally depending on what the primary note is, so that there's a sort of uneven, it's not threatening, but it's not quite, Earth either. And so yeah, I usually do that. I sketch, so to speak, with the stuff, and then I work it up to work as music, and then I put it to picture, and then go, okay, sometimes things work great. I've done this enough that sometimes if I watch a scene, I can feel what the tempo is without sitting there with it. But then there's things where you do go in and you have to have specific hits, or where you just do a whole new, now you've got this theme, you use it elsewhere. This is not a leitmotif score, except David Dane, the Drunken American, does have this sort of cowboyish kind of thing going. But I stayed away from that in general. There's sort of two different love scene themes which are kind of similar for the Martian. Captain Kirk takes home the prophet to save Earth, and she's hot, man, look at her. So that, if that makes any sense, it's very difficult to talk about music. But that's my process, is I just start without, I watch the movie, then I sit down and just think as I play stuff. And then sometimes the next day I get up and go, well, I don't really have anything like this, and then I play stuff. And then start to put it to picture where I go, oh, I think this will maybe go here, this will go there, but I finish out those themes, and then sometimes those themes don't get used in the movie. There's things in here which are, 10 seconds long. I wrote this great piece for the whole storm, and then the storm's only like, a minute long. So I was like, oh, well, so much for the other 5 minutes of, and she kills him, right? I mean, she electrocutes, she can control, she saves, I think she kills stupid Dubious. I find it really interesting that, this is a movie before there's really much air travel or thought about going into space. But the villain is the guy who thinks going into space is ridiculous. He turns out to be like jealous of the next generation, sort of beating him to it. I just wouldn't expect that from that era, And it's interesting, back then when Darwin came along, there was this whole thing, well, how do we resolve science and faith? Because there are scientists who had both, and then one cancels out the other. And so this movie deals a little bit with some of that too. Now we've just forgotten that, and it's just one or the other. Nobody tries to really resolve the. Oh, and you had something down here closer? Or did I accidentally answer your question?
No, but you led to it. Thank you for being here. My question was actually to ask what was the general scientific knowledge about space that was present with people at the time? Because like in this scene, for instance, the characters are clearly aware that there may not be breathable oxygen, but then there's no concept of gravity, like loss of gravity.
Which of course frequently in movies they don't want to deal with that.
I wasn't sure if it was a choice.
Around. The one question I wanted to read the script about was that clearly they know that there's no air in space. Yet they have a ship with props on it, and all he says is we've discovered a source, I believe is the word they use, to power us there. So I wonder in the script if it describes more like a kind of beam coming out of the ship. I mean, I know that they don't think they're flying with their props to Mars. I really want to know in the script how they deal with that. I like that the one thing they do right here is that it's an incredibly cramped little spaceship. There's no computers, so I think there's 6 of them. So that's like 3 men. It seems like you need 2 guys in the engine room, 1 guy steering it. So it's 12-hour shifts, And this, I think, is the first sort of space madness and mutiny movie. How many times have you seen that since? And there's always this concept that space travel, being there forever, that people would just turn on each other, especially when they're all stupid men, and one of them's a drunken American, just begging for trouble there. But yeah, so after I get the script translated, now that I've actually found it, I'm dying to know, because they seem to have no concept of rockets, and H.G. Wells in Things to Come, they have a cannon to sort of shoot somebody up into the air, which could possibly work, except it would just, like the guys who were down in Titanic, it would just squish them, into the bottom of the. But they have the thing right about you leave Earth at a certain position so that you don't have to travel as far because Mars will rotate into the thing. Yeah, and the spaceship is kind of a mix of like a dirigible, which was kind of the cutting edge of air travel at the time, and a biplane, which was also the new thing. But yeah, so I wish I had the answer as to what they, how they're going through space, but I know it's not with their 3 props. Yes, down here?
What you just said reminded me, the posters, are those posters the actual posters?
From different countries, yeah.
They kind of reflect what we see today, where it's a very spectacular airship, and then you look at the one they're actually in, and it's like a shoebox.
Right. Yeah, some of the designs on the posters are cooler than what they did in the movie. Now again, the American release is in 1920, which, is several years later. I think it's still way before any kind of Buck Rogers or that kind of stuff. But no, those are all period posters. And the German program book has some poems in it. And I wondered if any of them were written for that program. They're not. There's the Rite of Spring and some different kind of things for the German book. And they very much show the guy riding in the chariot, like a very kind of traditional sort of flying too close to the sun and you're wax, there's a whole kind of tradition which they're working into that, which I think is really interesting. And the naked guy going up, that's all kind of calling back to sort of Roman, Greek, classical. It's interesting. I don't know how much Ole and Nordisk had to do with some of that. I believe they had something to do with it. Yeah, right behind her.
I'm just really interested, like, where your head is at when you're doing this, because it seems like a really fun thing to do. But I know that you love scores and composers, and you know a lot about like what Max Steiner did and people later. So when you're doing this, are you Jay Woelfel in 1916, or are you Jay Woelfel now, or how does that work?
I try not to do, from when I first started doing this, or maybe before that, I don't know how many features you've watched with the kind of, no offense, rinky-dinky piano silent movie music behind them. You really, Ennio Morricone, there's an interview with him where he's playing some of his own themes for whoever's interviewing him. And he he stops himself and goes, look, I know the piano can be kind of tiresome, even irritating sometimes, but, so bear with me demonstrating these things. I know you're already sick of hearing, So now that I've done this, I particularly, there are people, Carl Davis, who's done a number of scores for silent films, kind of famously so. Neil Israel, who's part of the whole Israel team of the comedy, the Abrams brothers and the Israels, and there's somebody else who I'm going to forget right now. So I'm aware of those guys too. But no, I try to not score silent movies like they're silent movies, for one thing. I don't want that rinky-dinky. I mean, it's a feat to sit up, and I've done it a couple times, to sit and play something to picture for 70, 80 minutes. That's a real skill, but it's almost like sort of a stunt, and you really are only one person with one instrument. So this is like 15 or 18 J's, working over a bunch of weeks, to like get this stuff. So I really score it the way I look at it now. That's kind of the answer. And then what instruments and stuff like that, like I said, this time I decided to just stay away from woodwinds. For one thing, there was some good brass sounds. I played the baritone horn, and there's some baritone mixed in here with the French horns and stuff. So but a lot of it's kind of instinctual, frankly. Music's, not really an intellectual thing, and certainly not for films. Jerry Goldsmith said, film scoring, he would say, it's just how it came out. That's how it came out to me. Well, how do you think of Planet of the Apes? Honestly, I just have to say that's just sort of what came to me. And eventually he said, you need to learn a bunch of stuff about music, but unless you have the basic kind of dramatic instinct, you'll never be any good at doing this. And you either have that or you don't. And how you develop that, probably from watching movies or seeing plays or whatever. So and one thing I've sort of learned, certainly in a silent movie, you're not kind of fighting dialogue and sound effects, but it's kind of the worst thing you can do is like be sort of timid. It's like somebody talking just a little too soft. I want to hear you. What are you doing? Why don't you just shut up? So if you try to be timid, you've just got to kind of trust yourself. If this is your instinct for what goes with the scene, just do it. And sometimes a producer or you yourself will go, no, Yeah.
So that response feels to me like you're saying this is an indulgence, which is why would anybody do anything they want to do? Like that's why you should do anything you're doing. But do you think about what if these dudes who made this movie heard your score? Like how would they react?
There's in this movie, as far as I know, the Danish thing they posted has a piano score, but it's contemporary to now. It's not, they don't have an original score. It is interesting, there's a little bit of original scored for picture music you can find. And some of it is clearly like people not really understanding what exactly to play or what to do. So then, of course, a lot of it was people playing standards and things they knew and pastiches of Beethoven and stuff that seemed happy or sad or whatever. But Bernard Herrmann said that plays don't need music. Sometimes it'll work, but there's something about film that really needs music. Usually it's like an emotional connection. It's usually not some intellectual exercise, although there's great examples of that too. or it's just sensing whatever the color of the movie is, what the orchestration, what the sound world of that film is, which is a lot of the orchestra you pick. In this case, I was like, I don't want any woodwinds. I want kind of a warm, sort of brassy kind of thing, and it's a Danish, so it should be a little Germanic, although I'm not going to have a bunch of oompa oompa. I'm not going for that. My family's German, but I'm still not going to indulge in that. Again, that almost gets like the silent movie, like rinky-dinky, rinky-dinky, rinky. It's like, stop that, stop it. So it's kind of, I basically just act like I've been hired to score this movie now. And then sometimes there's things where there's a little period influence, or if there's somebody playing a particular instrument on screen. In my Fall of the House of Usher, Usher plays as in the original material a guitar, essentially. Lute. So the Martians sing in this, at the end where they're singing, I thought about, should I write a big song and stuff? And I ended up just sort of writing this sort of nonsense, gibberishy, are they saying real words or whatever? Because I really didn't want to hit it on the head that much. I could have went that way.
Like that Ewok song from...
Celebrate the love. Oh my God. I was a projectionist through film school, and so you always go up to the booth to turn the lights up, and so I had to hear that Celebrate the Love song like 4 times a day, and I was just like, I would just murder. They had this cool John Williams concert with sort of the best of Star Wars they showed downtown just recently. And I was so happy they didn't play Celebrate the Love. I was loving all this music, then it started to occur to me, it's coming, Celebrate the Love, it's coming. It didn't come for me. So that's my stumbling. But yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes, like when you make a movie, you go into it with some specific, I've got this one idea, I'm making this whole movie because of this one thing. And not always, but often I find that ends up being forgotten. You never do it. Other much better things end up taking the place for it, which is part of why you make another movie, because now you have some other one thing that makes you. So there's got to be some, and I suppose in this it was doing a sort of positive score for this, seminal outer space movie. You and I are big Star Trek fans, and this to me is like, so Trek. Yes?
2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Almost answers one.
Sorry, I tried.
The approach to Mars and the tractor beam, how much of that was there and how much did you recreate?
You can see in one of these posters they show like a sort of tractor beam kind of thing. That's something else I'd like to read in the script, because there's some times where they'll cut to a shot and they're sort of irising out, right? Where you have there's clearly so is there a whole shot missing where they irised into black and then they pull back out? I don't know. So seeing that poster and understanding the tractor beam thing, I was like, I think we need to see something going out from Mars. That's clearly what they're doing. They've got some mechanical things. They've got some telescopes and stuff. So when I did that, I was like, okay, well, what would they do? Well, you'd probably draw it on the film, so it'd be like an animated beam. And then when it hits the ship, that thing around it, that's actually, I found a whole bunch of smoke puffs. So that's actually what they would have to work with. I thought it was a really kind of cool kind of thing. But at least in the cut we have now, they're standing in the ship and the guy's like, I'm gonna give it to you. And then suddenly the guy grabs it and pulls it away. Well, that's because they've just, you cut to the scene with Mars and go, we're gonna zap them. But I was like, if you just jiggle the camera some, that's all you need to sort of tell you, to sort of complete the story.
And the Martian song,
So,
is it possible that sheet music exists for that? That something was actually...
I don't know. Now that I have the script, I can look and see if he actually wrote, because he might have, the script, some silent movies actually are written like a sound film. The actors have dialogue written in the scripts. This one does not. There's intertitles separately, handwritten, beautifully handwritten, and I compared those to all the intertitles in the film, and they're all identical, except for one that they cut. And I was like, well, I'm performing all this violence on this movie by adding effects, and I finally decided, I was like, no, there's no reason for it. Yes?
How much of the original dialogue, original titles, is it just all translated and all there, and how much did you add or change?
I changed nothing. Those are all the original. It's the Danish. They've only on their website. They have all these films. They all only have Danish intertitles. But some of them they've done like this, where apparently the original titles are so badly damaged they had to just sort of replace them. Only 2 films in their whole 400 have English and Danish intertitles. This one and End of the World. So I hope that they or somebody will go through, because there's some other really fascinating looking movies, but unless you speak Danish, after a while you're kind of like, I don't know. So I didn't do any. I did do a thing with, like, in terms of tinting the titles so that the dialogue is always white, but the non-dialogue is colored either to match Mars or whatever. When I direct films, I sort of try to deal with colors, like Hitchcock tried to teach us about the colors mean something. So they're just not just everybody's just wearing colors. So I thought, let's do that with the intertitles. I think subconsciously it'll help you kind of keep up with what's what. And also with original intertitles, on film, sometimes they would have very ornate backgrounds for specific titles. So I wasn't going to go that far, but I just decided, well, I'll try this sort of really limited color palette for the whole movie. So at the end, it turns green as he's talking about flowering into a new life, and, oh, thanks. But that was just something I thought, maybe this will subconsciously help the titles, if they're talking, or if it's, it's just nothing I'd seen done. And I was like, well, let's try it. Yes.
Well, quick comment first. I love the film, and I loved how the Martians have everything on Mars was something of something. There was the robe of justice and the cloak of
They've got the
innocence. And the tree of longing and the forest of love and the island of
chastity dance and dance of chastity.
I love that.
And now everybody take the floor for the dance of chastity. I think that would be the let's get another drink, let's sit down, or let's go out to the car and turn off the lights.
Misspellings were original then?
Yeah.
Because there's whole speech with an A.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't go in and try to that's all pretty good, when you get foreign Fall of the House of Usher, for example, the first silent I did. That film, if you've ever seen it, at some point somebody translated the titles into English, so there's running translations, and the French are the only things up there. And the titles are sort of very kind of specifically kind of designed, and I knew enough French to go, it's too shorthand. You're losing a little something in the, and so then I went and translated all of those. And like any kind of translation, sometimes you get in these situations of or people who argue about the Bible. They were sinners. No, it said they were homosexuals. No, it said they were sinners. It didn't really tell you what kind. That's up to you to decide. Maybe you write it in your version that way, but so that's all. Those are all original, aside from tinting them. And one of them, I think, I'll Be With Your Mother Tomorrow. The spacing was so bogus you couldn't follow it, so I kind of redid that one to do it. And I made them bigger than they were, and the original Danish on the website has Danish and English always. So you have to kind of look down all the time. So we're in America, so I'll blow it up. But for the Danes, I left both. So I recropped them, and I let them sometimes get bigger when people yell, which they did in silent film. Sometimes they would emphasize something by making the title bigger. Or you have like a no, 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 and it gets bigger. So it's funny, even before they had sound and people were going, Mendoza, Mendoza. They did it with silent movies, just with giant titles. In fact, silent films is a fascinating world of the crudity and sophistication. Yes?
So kind of, I may have said this before, but you're trying to make a better story than would have existed then.
Yes.
But you're also working in a framework where you're trying to honor the people. You're trying to do right by the people that made this movie.
Yeah.
In terms of what their intention was.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not blatantly doing a modern score with this one. I didn't. With the wind and with some sort of, music concrete, some sort of sound stuff I do, that's not purely just orchestral. But yeah, I'm not, in this case, I didn't, I've done electronic scores, but I didn't do that for this one. It just, probably because of the setting of it, and the whole kind of idea of the sort of Mahler, Wagnerian kind of world it was in, it felt like brass and low strings, and But something occurred to me, and I came up with something really cool, which was electronic. I probably would have happily stuck it in there and then maybe happily taken it back out. I've screened stuff for people with my scores and like left the room when certain scenes come up. Like, oh no, this doesn't work at all. Guys, I'm gonna go to the bathroom. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Just the second it started and I heard it with an audience, I was like, oh God, this is a really bad idea. But yeah, I'm trying to honor the movie rather than like make fun of it. I'm trying, just like it was a modern movie. If I was hired, it's like, this is what I think is not missing from the scene. This is what I can point out, or this is what really can benefit, or it inspired me to write something for this thing. So I'll just go with that.
So just for fun, like if what you're doing normally when you're making your normal movies or your scoring movies, it almost seems to me like you would be less worried about what someone thinks you're doing now than working within the context of someone else's movie from 100 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I will sort of stop and think like, what are they going for here, or
I don't
whatever.
want to get an email from this director and saying, hey, what you did was shit.
Yeah, who knows? I do sort of think about that sometimes.
It's kind of fascinating too, because you would never be in that situation unless you were working with that.
Right, and it's not, I've made my own movies and scored my own movies, and this is not like that either. It's not just like, oh, this feels right, and I'm not gonna say no, so just do it. So yeah, but it's an interesting, part of it I'm trying to connect it to an audience with like a, whatever amount of things we've learned or I've learned about what works with film music, I will put on this movie, where if you watched, and there are some people who very much just want the rinky-dinky piano music or want the original scores. And some of those are really good or some are really interesting, but they also kind of reveal a lot of limitations.
Or the original framing, right? Like
The original what? Figuring out what the frame rate on this movie was quite an adventure. 20. That was after a lot of missed guesses. Yeah, that was the big, anyway. Yeah.
So you mentioned original scores. Did every movie that came out have an original score, or just certain films?
Certain films, and they would send out sort of like you get a press book. Like as a theater manager, you get like these books which have like, here's art you could send to your newspapers. And one of the things in your book would be a thing, go, music. Here's some pieces we would suggest you use, possibly in this order. And they would list maybe a composer or just the titles if it was something you knew. Or if they had written like a love theme or some specific thing, it's like, here's Bob's theme. Use it if you like. So it'd be kind of musical suggestions. Or maybe some short scoring. They wouldn't score out a 10-minute scene, but here's like a.
So generally speaking, then silent film scores that audiences heard were more or less improvised in that specific situation with maybe some vague suggestions. So if the original filmmakers heard your score, it would not be disruptive. It would just be, well, that's what they're doing for this script.
Probably every time they saw it, it would be something a little different.
Yeah.
And quickly when movies left one country to another, like Nosferatu, they did the original. There was actually a score written for that movie, which I didn't know. It never really appeared or ended up on the movie till recently. So when it shipped off someplace else, did they get any notes? Did they just have to make it up? But you're right. Yeah, they wouldn't. The filmmakers wouldn't be used to hearing something or expect something because they wouldn't know. They'd never seen it with that pianist or that orchestra.
Well, like when Gaylord Carter used to play at the Silent Cinema here in LA, it was almost a very Carl Stalling kind of thing. There would just be, like you were talking about the pastiche, there would just be this kind of collage of familiar themes from everything from classical to just contemporary standards and things like that.
And a theater organ has a lot of sound effects for it too. Car horns and these kind of things, so they could be horse galloping. There was a whole set. There's a whole like musical machines, which are basically just noise boxes, which are a whole separate, which you can trigger from the organ. But it's a whole separate, there's a guy who has a whole thing, he's got one of these. And that's all it is like he doesn't even call it music. I forget what it's called, but.
So we're basically saying that Max Steiner was a revolutionary genius.
In a lot of ways, yeah. He and David O. Selznick. And the sound guy too, actually, who worked on King Kong. But yeah, David O. Selznick. What happened was when The Jazz Singer is a musical. They used musical sequences in it. So when everybody started wanting to do that, it was like, oh, that's what they want. Everybody wants music. So in the very crude, difficult to deal with any kind of sync sound days, they're also trying to produce musicals with huge numbers of people on stage. I think a lot of the stuff had to be recorded straight to the film, and if you screwed it up, you had to reshoot it all. So these were all very expensive, and they all bombed. And then all the studios are like, that's it. Talking pictures are about people talking. We're not going to hire orchestras. There's no music. You play something at the beginning and at the end, and that's it. And they used stock music from radio and stuff like this. And then David O. Selznick basically was like, no, we need music. And Max Steiner was brought in from New York because he'd done some shows in New York, and kind of like, hey, and O. Selznick would write the screenwriters, and he would write into the scripts music, why it's in the scene, what it's supposed to do, what it is. So Max Steiner had those 2 sentences, and he'd go like, okay. And his sound guy would work with him in terms of like how to figure out how to sync things up. Steiner would pick certain orchestrations because the sound recording techniques were so bad that certain instruments just sounded lousy. So you'd beef up your tubas with like saxophones and things like this, and you use more of this and less of that. Then they started to learn like, hey, if we put the microphone closer to this section, it's actually louder than the other section, so we can do that. You can't really mix yet, but yeah, a lot of what Steiner did, we still do. And David O. Selznick, in Steiner's defense, he basically wanted music on everything. And he wanted music people knew. People go to a Christmas movie, they want to hear Christmas music, more and more Christmas music. And Steiner was more like, no, everybody that's distracting, and they know that music already, and that's actually bad, so let's not. And so it was a real war. And those guys were both real kind of, I don't want to say control freaks. So Selznick was. The movies Steiner would do for David O. Selznick, he always knew. He was like, this is going to be 5 hours of music for like a 90-minute movie practically, He will let nothing go without there being, and he's going to want known tunes always. Whatever I write, it's going to be like, no, I'll play Jingle Bells, If you like the music and want to own it, my wife's out in the lobby. I have a few CDs. Maybe they're all sold, I hope, or if not. You could also get it through my website, jwoelfel.com. There's a streaming version you can get. And thanks so much for coming out and experiencing Heavenship.